pollination, coastal protection, tourism, food source, health, water filtration, clean air, climate regulation, all will be at threat with higher emissions. And we can value those ecosystem services, and I'm giving you here the example for coral reefs, and this is a slide from the Nature Conservancy. So you can see that we have many ecosystem services from coral reefs. For the marine life, we have 25% of all marine life in the sea that is in the coral reefs. That covers only 1% of the planet. You can see that tourism value is also important, food production, of course, and also health, because we can find many drugs in the coral reefs. And coastal protection is very important because corals protects the waves and the coastal erosion. And we have a flood protection from the coral reefs too. In fact, people value nature in different ways depending on their knowledge systems, languages, cultural traditions, and environmental context. And this slide is taken from the last IPBES value assessment report. So you can see that depending on the context where we are, we can give a different value to nature. And this is from IPBES 2, and they concluded that there is no shortage of methods and approaches to value nature, yet their uptake into decisions remains limited. Less than 5% of published valuation studies report uptake in policy decisions. And you can see where we have more studies that are going into decision making. It is mainly in Europe or the developed world. What we need now is a transformative change to address the global biodiversity crisis and shifting away from values that overemphasize so short-term and individual material gains to nurturing sustainability-aligned value across society. So this is from IPBES 2, and in the last IPCC report, we spoke about climate resilient development pathways, and this was the title of the chapter 18 in the IPCC Working Group 2 AR6 report. Nature is threatened by climate change, but also nature can be a solution for climate change. And even in the worst scenario, you can see that nature can help to mitigate climate change up to 38%, coming from the land and the ocean. And this is in the Working Group 3 ARC's report from IPCC. And in conclusion, in order to conserve natural capital against climate change, prevention is possible by helping nature to resist these environmental changes, maintaining a genetic diversity and restore certain ecosystems, helping communities to adapt, raising awareness. And you can see on this slide from IPBES 2 that nature can be a third of the solution. So not only it is threatened by climate change, but it is also part of the solution. Thank you for your attention. And I think this is also an interesting figure from IPCC when you see that we can live from nature, with nature, in nature, and as nature. Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Walid Al Saqqaf. who is the CEO and co-founder of Rebalance Earth, a global ecosystem services platform for valuing and funding a living nature to combat climate change, biodiversity loss, and lifting communities out of poverty. Walid started off in the corporate world at Barclays Corporate Banking in 1998. As a serial entrepreneur, he has co-founded 6 startups, of which one had a successful acquisition. Walid is an industry associate at the UCL Center for Blockchain Technologies and is a proud father of 2 little amazing daughters. Walid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nathalie. Right, so before I start this presentation, I just want to remind us, the data that we've been seeing from Nathalie, the speeches we've been hearing, it can feel pretty scary, what we're all facing. And there is this disjunction, if you want, between what we're hearing, what we're seeing, and what we're actually capable of doing. And sometimes, how does that actually relate? Sometimes, how does that we can make a change to it? I'm going to give today an example of what can be done, because Rebalance Earth is a collective of individuals who essentially are frustrated by this lack of empowerment. What can I really do to make an impact? And I'm going to tell you this journey about how you and all of us can have an impact in a real practical example. So just to remind us of some of the stark details before we go into a message of hope. We have had since 1960s enormous economic growth, 5,000%. That is wonderful. It has brought wealth to nations and people all around the world. That unfortunately has come at a cost, which is we've been extracting from nature. We've not been valuing nature. We've been taking, and taking to fuel this growth. And I want you to think for just 5 seconds. Is infinite economic growth possible on a planet of finite resources? This thin little blue globe that floats around an environment of emptiness in space. It's not possible. We need to change the way we value ourselves, value economic growth, and what it is based on. Because unfortunately, it is about destruction of nature because we don't value it. And again, it asks the question, is economic growth predicated only on the dead nature? Now, my colleague and friend, Ralph Chalmey, will be talking to you about, the work he has done with the forest elephant in the Great Whales. And I'm just going to mention one of his, pieces of work, which is a forest elephant is worth $40,000 dead for its ivory, but close to $2 million alive for the carbon sequestration services it performs in the forest. Today, we have a market for a dead elephant, but we do not have a market for a living elephant. Now, I don't know about how many of you guys here in this room or online or parents, but do you really want your kids to grow up in a world that has such crummy values? I, for one, refuse to accept that. And the thing is, those species, like forest elephants, they're part of what's called a keystone species. They're ecosystem engineers, or if you want, they're our real-world life superheroes. Because those superheroes have wonderful superpowers. They're called ecosystem services. They help to regulate our climate. They help to support within their ecosystem seed dispersal, nutrient dispersal. They help to provide fresh water holes for other species. And they do a whole lot of wonderful activities day in and day out for free. Thank you, everybody. They're doing that for us. And because of that, they're on a path of extinction in 10 years because we do not recognize their value until Ralph and his team said, wait a second, those elephants help to improve a forest carbon sequestration productivity by 7%. And that is worth $1.75 million. So we can link them to a market where they can have a value. And that's where we come in. We come in because we give corporations, households, capital markets the opportunity to employ the services performed by those forest elephants. Corporations need to meet net zero targets, and hopefully very soon they're going to have biodiversity targets that they're going to have to hit them. How are we going to hit them? By getting those elephants, or by getting the whales, or by getting the rhinos and other keystone species to be able to provide that service as a contractor for a corporation, for a household. You're employing them, you're recognizing their value. And it's only by recognizing that value that you start protecting them, because they're an asset, which have a real monetary value. So we, as Rebalance Earth, we basically blend natural capital in the form of keystone species with the best digital technologies to understand and to monitor it. And we package it up through an ecosystem services platform. And any companies who works with us can hit 8 of the United Nations SDGs. And how this works, apologies, the slide kind of changed a little bit. On the left-hand side, you have buyers, yourselves, corporations, capital markets. You can buy this ecosystem services credit at a value of $40. The value of that credit goes to pay the park rangers. If you want the nurses, the doctors that we have in our cities, the park rangers are the ones who protect the natural capital. We employ them, and we provide local investments to the communities that live within the surrounding of the elephant, providing them free healthcare, free education, job creation. You're linking their economic development to the welfare of the keystone, providing that credit. Because those credits are produced that every day we can detect a unique living elephant. We have motion activated camera traps, acoustic sensors, and DNA testing of the dung. Every time we identify a unique living elephant, we produce a credit of $40. All that is tracked on a Corda enterprise blockchain that provides the transparency, the traceability, and the trust. Now, I know what you're going to say. Blockchain, that nasty word, is pumping more carbon than anything else. You're right to some degree. Bitcoin, 125 million joules of electricity per transaction. Ethereum, before the merge, was 17 million joules of electricity. Ours, 24.7. That's it. Not millions, just 24.7 joules of electricity. That is less than the cost of an email. Yet it provides all the efficiency that blockchain is here to do. What does that mean for a corporate client? Well, you get a dashboard that says, well, you've purchased X amount of eco credits. This is how much carbon offsets has been delivered. And this is an example of how we transform your carbon dollars in carbon for social good. Here's the school that's being built. The most exciting tab is when you click on your tokens. Because for the duration of your contract, we can show you every single day, this is the elephants that produced that credit for you on that day. This is a video, this is a picture from Rosie the elephant that was taken yesterday from one of our motion activated camera traps. It's about bringing you straight into the forest to see that elephant doing its day-to-day activities, adding biodiversity value to the ecosystem, enhancing the forest carbon sequestration. You can see it. It's like, and that's for a corporation. Now imagine you're taking a flight from Geneva to New York, and you wish to offset your flight. You can get a video of Rosie the elephant offsetting your flight. So when you get back home, you can show it to your kids. Hey, look like what mommy or daddy did. I got that elephant to offset that flight, and the value of that offset has also gone to pay business nurse's salary, who's providing free healthcare to the local community. All that can be done through the data. Now, as a corporation, you must be thinking, why should I bother, right? I do have those targets, but does it make economic sense? Actually, it does. 84% of consumers look for companies who have a clear sustainability agenda, and 80% of them will want to support that. Equally, why is it good for investors? Well, 83% of personal investors will invest, divest, or lobby to change investments mixed based on their ESG factors. Crucially, if you're a CEO, if you have a clear sustainability agenda that is authentic, demonstrable, you get a 6% increase in your share price. Now tell me a CEO around the world doesn't want to get a 6% increase in their share price in front of their board. And also it's really good for employees. 69% of employees are looking for an employer who have a good sustainable strategy, and 70% will stay with their employment if they have a good sustainable strategy. This is very important in a European market, for example, that's got a severe labor shortage. Answer, get a clear sustainability strategy. So I want to cover a little bit about what is, if you want, the Rebalance Earth's core engine. At the top, you have the keystone species. It produces that token every day, that ecosystem services token that provides liquidity, cash, that can be used to be invested in sensors. Sensors that provide us the data that is useful for the scientific community to understand the other value that Keystone is providing, the biodiversity. Biodiversity is at the same level as what the Kyoto Protocol was in the early 1990s. We're just at the beginning of the biodiversity exploration, but we need data and we need scientists. And Rebalance Earth is here to promote that. The rest of the money goes to support those local communities. They are the stewards, they are the guardians of the ecosystems. Again, apologies, the slides are not quite working just out right. But if you take that core engine can be used to understand the value the elephant is producing, whether it is in servicing the forest that is good for the small herbivores, digging the water holes, which is useful for the small herbivores and also for the birds. When the elephant passes away, hopefully from a natural death, its body is fed by other species, in the great circle of life, if you want to use some of Elton John's songs. And then its dung is also supports the chimps, who eats the seeds out of the dung, and also for the forests. All that the elephant is producing. With Rebalance, we can then transfer that understanding in monetary terms. We can then start saying, actually, there's a link between the elephant and the chimp. The chimp eats the seeds from the dung of the elephant. And then we can use the chimp to explore their ecosystem services. So effectively, we're using each keystone as a node of understanding the entire value that is done by ecosystem services. And that becomes a tradable asset, because that ecosystem services credit that is purchased by yourselves, by a corporate, by a capital market, can be traded, and it can provide you a return in three forms: a carbon credit, a biodiversity credit, and an ESG credit. Investing in nature is not only good, the critical term here, it is profitable. You want to be able to attract corporates, not just because they want to have a good ESG strategy, but because it is profitable. The more profitable it is, the better, because we save more nature. By changing those mindsets. And once you start doing that, then suddenly you have the birth of a new era of economic growth that is powered on a regenerative, living nature. So I invite us to think about how 2022 and 2023 can be the beginning of 5,000% growth in GDP based on a regenerative nature instead of a dead nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Walid. Yes, nature-based solutions are a good way to fight against climate change. We had a good example on land, what is happening in the forest with keystone species. And Martin will tell us now about the marine, the marine solutions, the marine natural capital in mitigating climate change solution. Martin Koehring is a senior manager for sustainability, climate change, and natural resources at Economist Impact, where he leads sustainability-related policy and thought leadership projects in the EMEA region. He has directed Economist impact projects in areas such as food sustainability, decarbonizing technologies for cities, getting to net zero, the circular economy, ESG, and real-world impact, social impact, electric vehicles, and advanced plastic recycling. He is also the editorial lead of the Sustainability Project and head of the World Ocean Initiative, inspiring bold thinking, new partnerships, and the most effective action to build a sustainable ocean economy. His previous roles at the Economist Group, where he has been since 2011, include Managing Editor, Global Health Lead, and Europe Editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Nathalie, and great to follow Walid as well. And this is so inspiring to hear about this kind of economic transformation and thinking about the value of a living economy rather than a dead economy. So this is very inspiring, and of course, following on from that, talking also about the ocean economy is really vital, because it's often neglected that the ocean has a lot of value in terms of its natural capital. And some of those ecosystems I will be pointing out in this presentation. So this is, first of all, I will just kind of give a brief overview of what actually do we mean by marine natural capital, and some of those kind of stats and the overall value, but then also kind of diving deeper into some of those ecosystems, and particularly seagrass meadows. And I wanted to start with those because when people talk about marine natural capital, they often think about mangrove forests, because there are already some markets, like in terms of blue credits and these kind of things. But seagrass meadows are often neglected. So I wanted to actually start with that rather than relegating it to the kind of end of presentations, which often happens. And then talk about mangrove forests, because there's already a lot of exciting opportunities in that space. And then coral reefs, you already heard from Nathalie about some of the economic value in terms of natural capital and the ecosystem service provided by coral reefs, but also seaweed. And there are lots of exciting new opportunities when it comes to kind of giant kelp, for example. And of course, working at the Economist Group, we are, to assess kind of the economic potential of, these kind of upcoming innovations. So seaweed is critical in that space. And then finally, also talking about the rise of blue carbon markets. We heard already about making nature in a way kind of a tradable asset, and blue carbon markets in terms of the value that we see in the ocean economy is absolutely vital as well. So on that note, let's start with just go back on this overview more broadly in terms of what is marine natural capital. So of course, the ocean is absolutely critical when it comes to absorbing carbon, and often neglected. I mean, it's about 25 to 30% actually of global CO2 emissions that are absorbed by the ocean. So the ocean's ability to, as a carbon sink, is absolutely critical. There's also, the CO2 that is kind of 3/4 of all of the CO2 in 2019 was actually stored by the ocean, 33 billion tons. That's absolutely vital. But also looking at coastal and marine ecosystems more broadly in terms of their emission reduction potential. And we have here that per hectare the ocean has a much a bigger opportunity when it comes to carbon storage. So 1 hectare in terms of 15 hectares of tropical forests. So in terms of the carbon dioxide that each year is absorbed by seagrass, for example, is 15 times as big as for rainforests. And that's often something that we don't think about, because often these ecosystems are hidden in the ocean. We already heard about the value of a whale in terms of carbon sequestration opportunities, often neglected. I mean, restoring whale populations, for example, could have huge opportunities in terms of sequestering 1 gigaton of CO2 emissions per year. So these are all opportunities. And when we look at coastal wetlands, 14% of mitigation potential there. This means that if we want to keep global heating below 2 degrees, the coastal wetlands are absolutely crucial. And what we see here in this chart is something that the the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy has put together, which is kind of a study on the potential, if you want to keep the warming below 1.5 degrees, and restoring coastal and marine ecosystems has this huge opportunity in terms of 1.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. So it's part of these 5 solutions alongside, for example, ocean-based renewable energy, cleaner transport in the ocean. It's one of those 5 absolutely vital solutions to get us to 1.5, or at least to limit global warming as much as possible. But there's also, we're talking about mitigation, we're talking about climate change mitigation, but there's also the adaptation opportunity. We talked about some of the kind of, stopping storm surges, the wave energy that would come to the shores when there is like a cyclone, and those kind of things are often absorbed by coral reefs, for example, or mangrove and seagrass and so on. So that adaptation opportunity is often neglected when we look at the natural capital value of the ocean. And then also the ocean could, the ability of the ocean, its capacity to be a carbon sink could actually be enhanced through technical solutions. And there are controversial debates. I mean, there are people like Brad Egg, for example, you might have heard of him, who advocates a very strong geoengineering approach when it comes to ocean solutions. And there are some of these opportunities looking at storing carbon in liquid form, increasing alkalinity of the ocean, for example, electrochemical removal of carbon. All these opportunities could potentially further enhance the natural ability of the ocean. But I'm not going to go into any detail on that in this presentation, but have a look at some of the sources in the further reading as well. We did an article on checking in on ocean-based climate solutions. Have a look at that article at ocean.economist.com. I have included this quote here just to highlight the opportunity in terms of what we need to do. And this is from Mark Guff, from the CEO of the Capitalist Coalition, highlighting how important it is to articulate the value of marine capital. It obviously resonates with decision makers in business and government. And this is part of why we're here. We need to start articulating that value. Now let's talk about seagrass meadows. They're only 0.2% of the seafloor, but 10% of the ocean's capacity as a carbon sink. So it's often neglected because seagrass is often hidden. And the studies, that were cited also by Walid and Ralph Shami has been working on this as well, in terms of the value of carbon sequestration from seagrass, about 2.3 trillion. This is just one estimate, but it's there's a much bigger opportunity even when we look at some of the higher estimates. But it's neglected by policymakers. We look at the chart here, we can see that only a handful of countries really have embraced seagrass as part of their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. I mean, 159 countries have seagrass in their coastal shores, and but they're not really using them. I mean, they're not really highlighting them as an opportunity to be an opportunity to tackle climate change. Then there is these additional benefits that I talked about. It's not just mitigation. There's also, they provide nursery and for fish species. They are food source. They're home for many fish. They protect coastlines. I mentioned, the risk of storm surges and these kind of things that often seagrass helps to prevent. They produce oxygen, of course, and they also clean the ocean from, the harmful pollutants as well. So there's this opportunity that's often neglected. And there's huge decline, an annual decline of around 7% since 1990 when it comes to seagrass, often because it's neglected and people are not studying what is happening there. And that's up from just 0.9% before 1940. So there's this risk, of course, with climate change that we have more heat waves and these kind of things, and that will have an effect on seagrass. There are lots of interesting projects now in terms of restoration projects. There is in the UK, for example, in Sweden, there are really exciting projects currently that are happening there. For example, Project Seagrass, which is an initiative by Sky Ocean Rescue, Carlsberg, WWF UK, working with local communities and the UK government, for example. So there are these projects that are happening in that space. And just to highlight again why this is so important and why it's been neglected as well. I mean, blue carbon is mostly focused on mangroves, and this is a quote from Stephen Lutz, the blue carbon program leader at a Norwegian think tank, Grid Arenda, and basically saying it's out of sight, out of mind. And that's why I'm highlighting here as the first one, because it is such a huge opportunity. Let's talk about mangrove forests because they have been in the spotlight. They're obviously a very effective carbon sink. 20 billion tons of carbon are stored in mangrove forests, around 50 times more than in tropical forests. And of course, mangroves have the advantage now that we have seen all these wildfires around the world. They are protected from that. So they are a great way of storing carbon. I mean, there was a study actually that looked at the wildfires that have been happening in recent years. And when these trees regrow from the wildfires, they often grow more slowly to be more resistant to these wildfires, but then their carbon storage capacity is reduced. And with mangrove forests, we don't have that because they are immune to those wildfires. They are also important as nurseries for global fisheries. There are all these additional benefits. I mentioned also for seagrass, but for mangroves, of course, as well, in terms of flood defense, storm defense. They prevent, there's a study in 59 subtropical countries, and some of which you can read more about in the further reading and the online on our website. For those countries, the benefits in terms of storm and flood defense, it's estimated about $65 billion US. More than 15 million people are protected because of the existence of those mangrove forests. And of course, there's this insurance opportunity, and the insurance sector has been increasingly interested in mangrove forests. I mean, there are some initiatives when it comes to, for example, the World Bank, Swiss Re, Munich Re, and others, looking at the risk reduction value of mangrove forests. But over the past 50 years, half of the world's mangrove forests have been lost. And that's a real tragedy when we look at the opportunity here to tackle climate change. Policymakers are slowly waking up to this opportunity. The Seychelles announced at COP26, the plan to protect 100% of their mangroves as well as seagrass. There are also a lot of really interesting restoration projects. For example, in Vietnam, there's after the Vietnam War, a lot of mangrove forests were actually destroyed. But within 2 decades, they restored those mangroves in the Mekong Delta. It's a really encouraging story. And there are also the private sectors getting involved. Apple, for example, helped to fund a project in Colombia, for example. And there are these development opportunities when it comes to, for example, Sri Lanka, where mangrove reforestation projects help to create jobs for 8,000 women, helping them to help with the kind of water security in the area and kind of education and providing this kind of skills for mangrove restoration. So there are all these additional benefits. And I mentioned already, that tragedy that we are seeing when it comes to losing those mangroves. We interviewed Mark Huxton, professor of teaching research in environmental biology at the Edinburgh Napier University, and he was basically saying, if we look at the current projections, within 100 years we would lose all mangrove forests. And obviously, given the importance for addressing climate change, that would be a real tragedy. So it's really important to embrace mangrove forests' natural capital. Coral reefs, we already heard from Nathalie how important they are. 37% of fish species live around coral reefs, despite encompassing only less than 0.1% of the ocean floor. So it's a small space, but it's absolutely vital. They provide lots of ecosystem services. 97% of coastal wave energy can be absorbed by them. More than 1 billion people depend on coral reefs for food and well-being. 330 million people around the world live within 30 kilometers of coral reefs. I mean, often, because they're kind of hidden, we don't appreciate that there actually so many people depend on them in terms of jobs for fishing, recreation, tourism, potential for natural medicine. We heard how important, the opportunity is to discover kind of new vaccines and those kind of things. And coral reefs are kind of a breeding ground for those kind of natural medicine, for example. But half of the world's coral reefs have already been lost. 90% could be lost by mid-century. So it's absolutely vital to look at these kind of conservation initiatives, and some of which we have highlighted in some of the further reading that you can see here when we looked at indigenous-led governance of coral reefs, for example. Have a look at oceanof.economist.com for some of that further reading. So, for example, in Nicaragua, there's a lot of projects working with indigenous knowledge, for example. Coral Reef Rescue Initiative that WWF and others are working on that are really encouraging examples of this kind of work, bringing these different communities together, for example, helping to safeguard reefs, looking at food security, and really working with those local communities on these kind of resilience projects. And the Belize MPA, I just wanted to highlight that because that was something that is really exciting that recently was announced, the Marine Protected Area in Belize, which is something that is a kind of collaborative partnership, it's a public-private partnership, helping to kind of create this kind of bankable structure. And we talked about the need to create investable projects and marine natural capital, and the Marine Belize MPA in Belize is really a good example of that. It received an investment of $1.2 million, but there was like private sector involved, impact investors and NGOs. And there are many other examples, for example, now in Tanzania, the Chumbe Island Coral Park and others. So there's a lot of excitement around these opportunities. And just highlighting again why this is so important, we interviewed Carol Fuhr, from the manager at the Coral Reef Rescue Initiative at WWF, and she was talking about the need to embed these kind of projects within a collaborative approach. So looking at the tourism operators, port authorities, insurance companies, all working together with communities to contribute to this kind of planning for long-term. So seaweed. Seaweed has often been neglected as an opportunity for climate change because obviously it's also a source of nutrition. It's vital in terms of carbon storage. Actually, 173 teragrams of carbon per year are sequestered in seaweed. And the economic value of that, again, there's a wide range, but it has been estimated at 1.2 to 3.5 billion just in its kind of nutrient biomitigation services. The growth is enormous. I mean, it's growing every year, on average more than 12%. 2026, the market could grow to 85.5 billion by 2026. There are lots of applications. I mean, obviously the climate change opportunity is there, but it also is applied as a source of food, for example, as fertilizer. There's lots of opportunity, when it comes to feed for kind of, fish feed and others, cosmetics, biofuel. There's this opportunity in terms of methane, for example, that could be a good alternative to natural gas, for example. We have highlighted a case study here on Indonesia. Have a look at that in the additional resources. In Indonesia, where 1 million jobs depend on seaweed. A lot of artisanal kind of fisheries have been transformed to kind of being seaweed farmers. And there's even more opportunity to transfer some of those kind of into contractual arrangements and giving lots of people more secure employment. There's also the permaculture opportunity. There are trials already in Tasmania, Indonesia, Philippines to really work on this. Permaculture is really an agricultural system that kind of creates these kind of permanent sustainable harvest opportunities by working within ecology of that system. So it's a new technology that can really help to address some of those challenges, really make it an investable opportunity. Of course, there are challenges. I mean, often you have a lack of genetic diversity in these kelp farms. Marine heat waves, again, they have an effect. And often in those communities that want to go into kind of seaweed farming, there's a lack of access to finance. And just highlighting here the quote from the case study we mentioned in Indonesia from Dorun Yamin from Mary Oceans and Paddy Taba from Sea Green. They wrote a blog on our website highlighting this need for this integrated coastal ecosystem approach. So looking at seaweed farming in the context of climate change, food security, but also in terms of community development and resilience. And finally, this is the market that I mentioned, and we heard from Walid already, the great opportunity in terms of making nature an investable asset. And in terms of blue carbon, which refers to these kind of ecosystems that store carbon in the ocean, such as mangrove, seagrass, coral reefs, and so on. We have this demand now for carbon credits increasing by 15% from 2020, by 15 times from 2020 levels by 2030. So this is the decade where this market will really take off. Could be worth around 50 billion by 2030. And I mentioned already that these kind of co-benefits when it comes to these carbon credits, because they help create employment, skills, and community well-being for those kind of projects. And there is currently a supply-demand gap. There's lots of demand for those carbon credits because lots of companies, as well as highlighted, are looking into kind of carbon credits or biodiversity credits, but there's a gap in supply. But that will narrow, and there's already lots of exciting technological solutions, such as kind of geospatial data collection to help to better design, register, and validate, because these are the three crucial steps to make these projects viable: designing them properly, registering them, and then validating them. But there are some really interesting validation companies already around. We have highlighted some in this article that you can access on the in the edit sources. So Plan Vivo, for example, is one of those kind of accreditation agencies that have worked on on this kind of thing. There's also trading platforms, a Carbon Place, for example. There is the natural capital project for the ocean that the Natural Capitals Coalition is working on. And increasingly, blue carbon is included in the NDCs, which is really encouraging to see. I just wanted to encourage you to have a look at the Mikoko Pamoja project. You can see here on the right-hand side, the blue carbon challenge that Uplink Ocean put together. And one of those projects is the Mikoko Pamoja project, which we also highlighted on ocean.economist.com, which is really an interesting case study in Kenya, where 35% of the proceeds from those carbon credits are invested in the project itself, but 65% are reinvested in the community, and that has helped with water security and has helped with creating local education opportunities. And there are other examples, such as in Colombia, where we have the Vida Mangla example. All this is mentioned in the further reading as well, creating lots of opportunities for local communities as well to create these blue carbon assessors, creating kind of new jobs in that space. So what we have is we have a huge opportunity to embrace this. And Christian Telecki from the World Resources Institute, he highlights this in this quote, saying that blue carbon is really going to take off, going to grow exponentially within the next 12 to 18 months. It's going to be a big feature, hopefully at COP27, for example, later this year. A huge opportunity, not just for climate change, but also for food security and addressing poverty. So I just wanted to conclude with those 5 key takeaways. So first of all, blue carbon and the natural capital from the ocean has a huge mitigation potential, not only mangrove forests, but also seagrass, seaweed. We didn't even talk about tidal marshes and these kind of things. There are many other opportunities. There are these co-benefits, so it's not just mitigation, it's also adaptation, helping with those storm surges, being flood defense and those kind of things, but also creating more biodiversity and helping with that community resilience. The examples I mentioned from Indonesia, for example, and Kenya, are really good examples of building that community resilience. But they are under threat from climate change. I mentioned these marine heat waves. They're also under threat from development, which often neglects that natural capital by looking at kind of installing grey infrastructure and thereby destroying that carbon storage potential, but also pollution. Policymakers have started to embrace it, luckily, although, as I mentioned, seagrass, for example, hasn't really been mentioned by many of the countries in the NDCs, but that is changing. We saw at COP26 the Great Blue Wall. You might have heard of this initiative by UK, France, Ireland, Kenya, Mozambique. So it's really bringing developing countries together and many other countries on this kind of approach on marine conservation, boosting livelihoods, working with communities, and so on. And finally, it's all part of a holistic approach. We need to build integrated coastal management that includes these natural capital solutions. There are already digital cooperative platforms emerging that can help with the transparency and traceability of these opportunities. Have a look at some of the resources I mentioned on ocean.economist.com. All of these resources are accessible free of charge. And yeah, exciting to continue the conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. We understood that we need to conserve and restore nature on land and in the ocean to protect our climate. In fact, human well-being and the planetary health are linked. So now we will try to understand the innovative financial mechanism for financing ecosystem protections. And for that, we have our last panelist, but not the least. Aiaze leads a joint UNDP UNCDF program on digital finance for the SDGs, advancing digital finance innovations which address the interlinked climate, nature, and poverty crisis. Previously, he was senior advisor for the UN Secretary General's task force on digital financing of the SDGs. Aiaze started off in the digital finance sector, where he spent more than 20 years advising startups and international organizations across the globe on inclusive finance policies, innovations, and business models. Aiaze Mitha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nathalie. Good morning, everyone who's in the room. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those who are online and following us from all parts of the world, maybe even from the metaverse. I think that's something that needs to be acknowledged in all presentations these days. I'm not going to be too long. It's really difficult to come after Nathalie, Walid, and Martin, because there's so much passion and enthusiasm and knowledge and science that permeates through their presentations. One wonders if there's anything valuable to add to what's been said. But I'll try to just be brief and offer a few comments and a few thoughts, hoping to complement or reinforce some of what's been said a bit earlier today. I'd like to preface my presentation with a few comments or a few thoughts. First of all, we are going through a global pattern of interlinked and interconnected crisis in which nature is really at the heart and at the center. We've gone through a pandemic, and we've seen how planetary health is really intricately connected to human health. We have an ecological collapse, which is the topic of today and why we are all here to discuss mechanisms for valuing nature. And I hope that the conversation will go beyond just a utilitarian view of nature as a solution to the climate crisis and the climate mess that we've put ourselves in, but something that goes beyond that, because deep inside, if we all remove our corporate hats and our organizational hats and we wear our human hats, deep inside in our hearts, we know that nature is important. We know that nature is essential for us. And I hope that this is the conscience and the value that's going to be driving the conversation as well. Even though the climate crisis is an important crisis we need to address, we know that there's a looming sovereign debt crisis, and that will be affecting many countries' abilities to fund the conservation efforts of the natural assets and natural capital that they have, which is so critical for all of us. And we know there's social inequalities that are growing across countries, within countries, and particularly in regions where local indigenous people are affected by the effects of climate change. Speaking of climate change, we know that reducing our carbon emissions is not going to help us achieve the 1.5 Celsius target that we have to protect our future. We are, first of all, not on track to achieve that, but we need to then really worry about augmented carbon sequestration capacities. We also know, and I've already mentioned, how nature is important to all of us, including to our economies. $44 trillion, which is half of the global GDP, is moderately or highly reliant on nature. And that's hugely significant. I think the corporate world and the finance world is opening their eyes to this, but it's essential to recognize that. And of course, no surprise, and I think Martin was mentioning the demand, the growth in the demand for carbon credits. No surprise that there's a growing demand on the part of investors and corporates for environmental, natural welfare projects, projects that really support the sustainability and the well-being of nature. And the kind of solutions we're discussing today is actually are going to help us provide some supply to meet that demand. Of course, all of that is premised on the fact that nature is rendering and offering a range of ecosystem services. That's already been mentioned this morning. We've talked about supporting services, provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services. So I'm not going to go through all of this. There's a lot of different complex graphs and very complicated infographics that explain what nature ecosystem services are. I found that one to be very simple and easy to understand and to grasp, even though it's incomplete. But we know that all these ecosystem services are something that we all depend on. And so once you recognize that, and once you're able to use all these different methodologies, there's more than 50 methodologies today to measure the value of ecosystem services. How do we start creating a market to monetize that? How do we design innovative financial instruments to be able to monetize the value of these ecosystem services? And of course, there's a whole range of technologies that can help us achieve that. Among those technologies, distributed ledger technologies, decentralized finance, refi technologies are going to help us achieve that, because they help us design innovative financial services. They help with traceability, immutability of financial transactions, but also asset tracking. They help us with the governance models that require equitable distribution of governance among the different participants, which is really essential and critical for the success of these type of projects. And there's programmability, which allows us to design all sorts of KPI-based payments on the achievement of specific KPIs and targets that we have for conservation. So for instance, if your KPIs are designed in terms of carbon sequestration, or if your KPIs are designed in terms of the conversion of agricultural land into agroforestry, this can be tracked, and this can actually, through programmability, generate automated payments to the different stakeholders that participate in rendering those services and meeting those targets. And of course, there's the whole NFT space, non-fungible tokens, which is also growing significantly. And if you look at the numbers, I don't remember them by heart, so I need to look at the slide. There's about 37 billion that's been transacted in dollars in the NFT space just for this year until May 1st. Which is already pretty much equivalent to what's been transacted last year. And I'm mentioning this because there's a whole range of initiatives in the NFT space that really start targeting conservation-focused NFTs to finance conservation efforts. There's projects like Project ARC, there's projects like Wild Earth, like Conservation NFT, that are starting to issue NFTs, the proceeds of which will be directed towards conservation financing and conservation funding. Now, because this is about use cases, I just wanted to talk from among the portfolio of projects I am currently involved in. I just wanted to talk about one project, which is more about forests. We've talked about elephants and keystone species. We've talked about oceans and seagrass and the entire ocean ecosystem. I wanted to say a few words about forests. And so the project we are currently in the process of designing, and it's in design stage. The aim is to pilot it in early next year. So we're still in the process of designing. There's a lot of answers, but there's also a lot of questions. And we're going through them at the moment. Is in Argentina, in the Chaco province, which is part of the Gran Norte area, which is the second largest forest in South America, after the Amazon forest. And one of the challenges that the province of Chaco was facing was, how do you actually find the funding that's required, the financing to support conservation and restoration efforts, while creating co-benefits for the local indigenous populations that live in those areas and support their economic resilience, their development, and work towards the attainment of the SDGs? How do you reconcile the two, and how do you actually find the funding that's necessary? And one of the ideas that came through was to create a system by which Argentina and the Chaco region and the Gran Norte in particular could be actually paid for the ecosystem services that those forested areas with the peatlands and wetlands that go with it are generating. And so we are designing a pilot. We've done, first of all, a first estimate of the value of ecosystem services just for the Chaco region. And that's been done by other international organizations involved in the project using the WAVES methodology. And the baseline estimation is showing that for the Chaco region alone, the total value of ecosystem services would amount to $120 billion. For the Gran Norte area, it would be in the range of trillions of dollars. And so we've decided to focus on the Chaco region, finding an area of 100,000 hectares that has strong potential social benefit and social value. And we've started tokenizing the value of ecosystem services delivered by that particular area, to be able to put that on the blockchain as an investable instrument in which corporates and financial institutions would be able to invest. Of course, that investment has to be aligned with territorial development plans, because one of the things that I mentioned is that we want to create co-benefits. And so the local indigenous people that will be affected have to be involved in the design of the territorial development plan, which will be part of the projects that will be financed. So the proceeds of the sales of the token are not going to go just into paying for conservation and restoration, but they are going to go towards specific projects that are part of an approved territorial development plan. It means access to clean water for the populations. It means access to clean energy, access to education, access to healthcare, digital connectivity, etc., etc. So that's already been defined and that's already been designed. The token platform is in the process of being defined and developed right now, and I will mention to you some of the economics in the next and final slide. Of course, there's a whole system of digital monitoring, reporting, and verification that's being designed at the moment to be able to monitor, report back, and verify impact, because the assumption is that those interventions both in terms of conservation and local community development, are going to generate value. They're going to generate carbon gains. They're going to generate biodiversity gains, and all of that can be valued through different mechanisms. And I'll talk a bit about some of these mechanisms, but that's going to generate value, but you need to provide proof of impact and proof and verify and report back on the impact generated. You need, of course, a very robust legal framework and institutional framework to be able to achieve this. And fortunately, the project in Argentina is led directly by the presidency, by the Office of Strategic Projects under the presidency. So you can imagine that the central bank is involved, the Securities and Exchange Commission is involved, the Ministry of Finance is involved, the Minister of Environment is involved, the Minister of Interior is involved. There's a whole range of governmental stakeholders in addition to international organizations that come together in making sure that this is happening. And as a matter of fact, there's a few things that have already been enacted in the framework. One is the payment for ecosystem services concept that has actually come into law in Argentina. And the provincial registry of ecosystem services has also come into force as a complement to the national registry to avoid double accounting at the national level. And then the idea is to actually start creating that marketplace where those tokens generated from the interventions can start appreciating and can start trading. A few things I'd like to mention, and this is my last slide. I told you that I would be very brief, but I hope there will be a longer conversation afterwards. So first of all, there's a provincial bank from the Chaco region that's going to issue the token. And the token is going to be issued in US dollars. We are still debating the amount of token, the dollar value of the token, but just right now we're leaning towards a parcelization of the 100,000 hectares of the pilot region that I mentioned into areas of 1 square meter. And right now the kind of value that we're looking at for the token is about in the range of 10 cents of a dollar pretty much for 1 square meter. That's based on the baseline estimation of the value of ecosystem services. This is going to be issued by this issuing bank, which will take a percentage fee just to maintain the whole infrastructure from the blockchain platform to the MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification system that I just mentioned a bit earlier that needs to be covered as part of the operating cost of the project. And the balance will be transferred to a trust fund that will then be in charge of investing the funds into SDG-aligned projects, as I mentioned, that will be targeting local communities and conservation efforts and restoration efforts. And the idea is that the value that's generated through the interventions is going to appreciate the value of the token. Those values are going to be in terms of biodiversity gains, and they're going to be in terms of carbon emission reduction gains, carbon sequestration gains. There's two ways of doing this in terms of how do you actually design the economics. One way is to say through the intervention, we can actually monitor, report, and verify the biodiversity gains and the carbon sequestration gains. And then you go to a third-party certifier, a Vera, Gold Standard, Plan Vivo, to convert that into biodiversity credits and carbon credits that you can either trade in voluntary markets or you can sell to buyers at a pre-agreed price. And the proceeds of that sale goes back into the system and goes back to investors in terms of investment plus return. That's sort of one model. The other model would be, and that's the one we are sort of leaning towards in Argentina, is to say, we don't want to convert that into carbon credits and biodiversity credits at the moment, because we don't want to sort of enter that market that has a lot of gaps and distortions at the moment, including speculation. But we want to build the value generated as measured against those measures into the value of the token itself. And we want to create a marketplace where this token will be exchanged. So at the moment, the idea is to create a tradable exchange in which those tokens that will appreciate in time, the value of which will be augmented by the nature and the amount of carbon sequestration and the biodiversity impact that I just mentioned, is going to be traded on that market. And at some point, when and as needed, we'll create the linkages into carbon credit equivalent and into biodiversity credit equivalent for investors in the latest rounds, if you would like, to be able at some point to exit and get some liquidity. So that conversion into carbon credit equivalent and biodiversity credit equivalent is only going to happen in the final stages. For now, it will be a closed marketplace in which those tokens will be traded between different types of investors. That's the plan. The idea is to pilot that in the first quarter of next year. And from the pilot learning, we will be then rolling it out across the entire area. And the other objective is to actually create from that a best practice, if you would like, type of solution and toolkit and guidelines, etc., that will be shared more broadly with the international community. And that's sort of one of the projects we're working on right now on the forest areas. There's others that we could mention, but I guess we don't have the time to discuss all of this today. So I just wanted to thank you all for your attention. I know it's been a long session so far, and looking forward to the Q&A discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Aiaze. After those very interesting and inspiring presentations, I think that maybe you have questions on the floor for the panelists.
Any ideas about how to scale up these projects? Any of you?
Okay, so in terms of scaling, you always need a demonstrable pilot to excite both the local communities, the investors, and all stakeholders on what is the art of possible. And then once you've, in the case of Rebalance, you've demonstrated in one jurisdiction with one keystone, then you start expanding it in terms of other jurisdictions and other keystone species. The aim, of course, is to develop a scientific framework that is robust enough so that any country around the world can upload their own keystone species onto the platform. And thus they can start monetizing those services, they can start improving the economic development of the local communities, and they can start building a kind of regenerative model for their country's economic growth. But you got to, as you know, the expression in the startup world, you start small and then you rapidly iterate and you scale. That's our approach. I don't know if you have views, Aiaze?
Maybe I'll just add a quick perspective before passing you the mic, Martin. I think that there's a number of elements to be considered. First of all, there's elements from the investor side, there's elements of trust, there's elements of risk on the supply side of money. And I think we need to find ways of diversifying that across geographies, across projects, across landscapes, across species. On the demand side of money, there's capacity and capability to design such solutions at a national level. In the case of Argentina, there's been a very strong commitment, and it's a high-level, high-profile project. But I'm assuming that not all countries around the world will necessarily have all the skills and capacity and capability to actually build and design those systems. So I would say probably because of these two reasons, both on the demand side and the supply side, I think a global exchange would actually add a lot of value where things could be defined and standardized in an easy way for countries to be able to just plug in their projects, whether they're about forests, they're about oceans, they're about keystone species, and where investors will find themselves in one single marketplace to be able to choose from among different projects that would abide by certain standards, and to be able to diversify their risks across a whole portfolio of projects and initiatives. So I think as much as, because the heavy lift and the cost of designing this, and I'm sure you can attest to that, is enormous. And having a global exchange for all countries and all investors to be able to plug into would be a very effective and efficient way of trying to achieve scale, as opposed to doing it on a project by project basis.
That's a great point, and just to echo those points, the market in a way can help with that, because as we said before, a challenge here is that these projects kind of need to be comparable. I mean, they need to be in a way, kind of, you need to register them, you need to monitor them, you need to validate them, and then you turn it into something that can be traded on an exchange. But some of these projects can be very unique to their circumstances. Like, for example, the Mikoko Pimoja project that we looked at for mangrove forest, they have their very unique local circumstances in terms of the history of that mangrove forest, the history of conservation of it, the local community involvement, the NGOs and so on. And the Indonesia one on seaweed, for example, is also incredibly unique to the local farming situation there, like seaweed farming. So it's very unique, but then by turning it into a market, you force, in a way, better monitoring, better impact assessment, and those kind of things, without forgetting about those local circumstances, because ultimately it's about, and as this example showed with you know, the Mikoko Pimojo project, more than around 2/3 of the project are reinvested into the community to create jobs and so on. So they are unique, but I think creating a market, as the other panelists said, is absolutely vital.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, can I have a microphone? Yeah, thank you. In that sense, like on top of only scaling up, like the investors and of course the citizens are demanding disclosure and impact evaluation, as you have just said. We've seen that investors are kind of more used with redisclosure, like carbon emissions. And now when you deal with natural capital, it's not only about carbon emissions. So how do you feel that this challenge of disclosure of different type of variables for impact evaluation can be addressed in the short term, so these instruments are scaling up as well?
Yeah, maybe if I can start answering that because of the microphone. I mean, there's definitely lots of excitement now around the EU taxonomy. I mean, the EU taxonomy, as you know, is about what is a sustainable activity. And although it is sometimes very artificial, there's been controversy around, for example, is natural gas sustainable or not? But this is coming to biodiversity. From January next year, the EU taxonomy will include activities around biodiversity, nature, pollution. So the expansion of the framework in the EU, and the EU is often seen in a way as a global standard setter. You know, when the EU starts doing this, then others try to replicate because you want to trade with the EU, you want to have good, you know, investment relation with the EU. So I think that is a very exciting development. And already there's lots of consolidation around reporting frameworks, like the International Sustainability Standards Board, for example, and others. But I do think the EU taxonomy is going to be a game changer. And already CDP, for example, which is, you know, carbon disclosure and so on, but has started to look into, like, you know, they have looked into water risk for about 10 years, and now it's really taking off. They will be increasingly looking at other natural assets. So I think it's those reporting frameworks that's going to make a huge difference.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of words. So first of all, yes, absolutely right. The EU taxonomy is going to be a game changer, at least for Europe, and then it will be probably, it will inspire others to follow, hopefully. I think the other thing is because of the way those projects are designed, and because they link carbon and they link nature and they link people's welfare and the SDGs, it's a much broader ESG play that's also appealing to investors in a way that supports their claims around neutrality and their net zero transitions in various ways. And there's another element of value creation also for investors. It's really in terms of how they engage consumers, not just investors, but corporates, how they engage consumers and employees around these topics. And there's a huge value creation effect in those areas because the way as a company, I mean, you've seen how the news from Patagonia has been shared globally and has spread like a bushfire. And I shouldn't talk about bushfire in this discussion, but you see the effects that it has on people. There's a huge level of global awareness around these issues, and investors and corporates that are going to be first movers in that space in terms of addressing this as part of their ESG and net zero transition strategies, but also are going to effectively engage their consumers and their employees around that, are going to be able to create immense value for themselves.
Thank you. So, I mean, great question. And as the panelists have been saying, you know, there's a lot of work that is being done, both at an institutional level. There's, you know, the EU leading the charge, but there's also, you know, the TNFD, the Task Force on Financial Disclosures, which is doing lots of very interesting work. But corporates themselves, some of them are doing some projects which are perhaps a bit more pioneering than others. And this provides us some learnings that we can all benefit from, whether they're successful or not. There's still learnings that we can all build upon. And I think that's why it's exciting, is that the more we start seeing corporates who have a much more of a pioneering approach to these, the more we're going to have things that we can build upon.
I see another question, Renate.
Yeah, I actually have two questions. I know that you guys are more focused on biodiversity markets. But the problem that I have when people talk about biodiversity is that they mainly focus on things like keystone species. But biodiversity is like a very complicated matter. It involves multi-species interactions. And it's through these species interactions that ecosystems can provide services. They perform a lot of functionalities. So how are you planning to consider this into evaluation framework at the whole range of biocomplexity, multi-species interactions? And are you considering like a biodiversity baseline, or is more like the full ecological potential that can be captured in a particular habitat? Because that's also very critical to try to establish like a baseline or a reference point in order to calculate biodiversity. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, I'll start off with providing an answer. So you need that baseline. So for example, in any location in which we start, we do an eDNA analysis, which is basically you take soil samples, you take water samples, and you take insect samples to try and understand what is biodiversity richness within any ecosystem. So that provides our baseline. And then we start monitoring how has elephant density within a square kilometer influenced that baseline. Has it increased it? Has it reduced it? But we need that understanding. Now, you got to look at an ecosystem. You got to look at the biodiversity at an ecosystem level, right? We start as a keystone species for a number of reasons. Well, you need a beachhead, right? Within an ecosystem. You need a beachhead that inspires people that wishes to start, whether it's the whales, whether it's the elephants. They provide that initial inspiration for people to go over that learning curve. That biodiversity is a potential. You need that to get over the learning curve. Once you've done that, then you start identifying all the other species that are linked within that biodiversity, because you got to have a holistic view to an ecosystem. But I strongly believe you need that initial beachhead, and that's why we're using keystones, but only as an initial trigger. The view is to look at an ecosystem level.
Just to add to that, I mean, it's basically in the ocean, you can see this a lot around coral reefs, where there's so much interaction between different species. And actually assessing that baseline is absolutely vital, but it has in the past been difficult to do. I mean, especially in the ocean, where it's more difficult to kind of do this kind of data gathering. But there is now more geospatial data and so on. So I think it's also, happening for the ocean, particularly around, coral reefs, but also seaweed and so on. There's aquaculture. There's more assessment of health, of ecosystem health. So I completely agree. It's about assessing ecosystem health from a holistic level, and then you can go into their individual species. But it is that ecosystem level ultimately that determines the individual health of each species, but it's that interaction. I think like ecosystems like coral reefs, tropical forests are so intricate and so complex that it's important to take that ecosystem level approach.
One quick comment. I'm not an expert in valuation methodologies at all. But so obviously we are limited as humans in our understanding of how ecosystems function and all the interactions and the level of complexities. And so as long as you use a methodology to get a baseline, and that's what we're trying to do, for instance, in the project in the Chaco region, a particular methodology that's going to provide you with a sufficiently interesting valuation of that ecosystem, and you keep measuring using the same approach to be able to compare apples with apples, then you're able to show the incremental benefit and translate that into incremental value and appreciation of the tokens and create the market for it. So I guess we are limited in many ways, but as long as you apply consistently the same methodology as you compare, you're in a good place. It's consistency.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I was stumbling a little bit when this question round started. When the first question was for how to scale up. Of course, upscaling is important, but it's also representing the old growth model, and we all know that this growth model has its borders, and we are very close to them. So what I really think is I repeat, there's surely it's a need for some sort of scale up, but I think what we need is a new definition of how to scale up and a new definition of the growth model. And I just wonder if any of you guys has an answer to that, because of course this also will be essential for the future of what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a valid question as around, are we, just repeating the same kind of economic model that we had before, which is about that rampant GDP growth, that chart that we saw. But then for these projects, actually, the scale matters. Like, for example, giant kelp is one good example where if you have small scale projects that are just too small to be investable, it's not going to be seen as an exciting investment opportunity. So you have these kind of in Tasmania, Indonesia, and other places where there are these pilot projects, but ultimately it's about convincing investors and also governments that this is a huge opportunity for them because it's been neglected. So I do think in this case, actually, growth is really important because it's from such a small base. So we need to start scaling those opportunities. And I don't think it contradicts this idea, that we need to look at kind of local communities, small scale, achievements in local communities, because ultimately those projects are still too small to make such a meaningful impact. Seaweed is such a good example for that, but we really need to embrace this as a growth opportunity. So I'm making the case for scaling up these opportunities because they're just too small at the moment. I don't think there's any risk in those growing too much.
Sure. I mean, I would invite you to look at growth in a slightly different manner, right? We need to regrow biodiversity. We need to at least foster an environment for it to come back to life. One of the things we've seen during this COVID situation is when we're all locked up in our homes, nature creeped back in. We just need to figure out a way how we can still be outside our homes and for nature to come back in a manner where we can cohabit. And I think the more we can encourage an environment where nature can grow and that we can grow with it, it's a good thing. And by having projects, whether it is in the ocean or on land, that proves that this can happen and that corporations can grow within that. You don't want to create an us vs them mentality. It's not going to work. We need to be working all together because this threat is just too big at the moment. And I think a growth model that is where GDP, if you want, and I know there's a lot of issues with it, but it's based on a regenerative nature instead of an extractive nature is the way to go.
Just to add something quick, we don't have to all, of course, respond to the question, but I just wanted to add a quick thought as well. I think it's also a matter of how you measure. And I think, as you said, regenerative model that underpins the GDP measure is one thing, but there's a number of countries now that are moving way beyond just GDP as their dashboard. They're looking at human happiness indexes. They're looking at health, well-being, all sorts of indicators. That's true in Bhutan, that's true in New Zealand now, and many other countries. There's multiple ways of measuring, and I think that more and more countries are actually starting to really adopt dashboards that go way beyond GDP, and that's also very helpful in the scaling discussion.
Gross ecosystem product is a good example for that. You mentioned the well-being index and so on. Gross ecosystem, GEP, is a new way of measuring this.
Do you want more questions?
Yeah, a quick question. When I started working on environmental issues 20 years ago, it was the very early days of clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. And at that time, there were very hot debate about are these useful? Are these the right way to go? Carbon credits. And listening to you, it seems that 20 years later, there is a broad consensus that yes, this is a very good thing to do. And what is the evidence that we've gotten over the last 20 years that make us think that credits are a good solution and not a dangerous distraction?
Interesting question, please.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And actually, I think there's an article in the FT just today about how companies are really embracing carbon credits more for the marketing than sustainability opportunity, because a lot of companies that buy carbon credits, they shout about it. If you do it because it is something good and you think it's going to create value for as we said before, for your employees, for society, for the economy, and for well-being, you don't necessarily need to shout out about it so much. The fact that it's the marketing departments of companies that do it is a risky thing, and so I agree with you to that extent that currently it's misused a lot for marketing. And as we know, net zero ultimately is about reducing to zero as much as possible. You can apply that to biodiversity as well. The loss of biodiversity should be reduced to zero as much as possible in your own company. If you're a food manufacturer, you look at your whole supply chain, how can your whole supply chain help you reduce as much of biodiversity loss as possible, or even regenerate biodiversity as much as possible? And then you buy those biodiversity credits for all that you can't do, for that rest. But as with the net zero conversation, it has often been used just as an excuse to keep doing the wrong things and just buy those credits. So we need to keep monitoring that. But I do think overall they're a good invention. We just need to be careful about those things.
So I think something very fundamental has happened since the Kyoto Protocol. Education, knowledge has grown exponentially. And also there's a generation game, right? Gen Z generation is not going to accept PR or marketing messages by a corporate that just buys carbon credits to say we're now net zero, right? That's just a transaction. You're not a stakeholder in nature. You're not investing in nature. You're just doing a PR transaction. So you have this new generation who are going to be the new consumers, who are going to be a new employees, who are going to be a new investors, who are a lot wiser now to, let's say, my generation was, or is, I should say. So there is this factor. There's also the factor that now climate change, is now at our back door. It's not something that's happening in a distant land. It's now happening, in the heart of Europe. It's now happening in the heart of North America. So again, people are becoming more and more aware of it. But yes, carbon credits are very often associated with greenwashing. And that's why, we look at other interesting projects like ourselves, who says, well, how can you use our initiatives for you to have an authentic and traceable and transparent means of measuring your action as an investor, as a stakeholder in nature? In a similar way as in Patagonia, it's in their DNA, if you want. It's not something that is done on the side. So I think that's what has been happening. It has taken some time. And I'm hoping with the case of biodiversity, it's going to take a lot less time than it had with the carbon credits.
Yes.
Yeah, quickly, I agree with what my colleagues have said. I think, and that's my personal opinion that I'll just represent here. There's a lot of issues with carbon markets. We know those issues around fragmentation, volatility, and all sorts of things, right? But that's the next best solution we have at the moment. Until everybody is held to triple accounting, and hopefully that will be happening at some point, and that gets built into how businesses are run effectively. We need to find ways of injecting more meaning into carbon markets and biodiversity markets and other such markets. And I think, as Walid was saying, the kind of projects we're working on are trying to give a bit more substance and a bit more meaning to these markets and to these exchanges until such time that we have a better solution as well that becomes sort of more innate and more built into the ways corporates are managed and corporates are being run.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes.
Yes. I was wondering how you would mitigate the value of a live elephant or of reintroduced wolves and bears against the impact they have on the environment of the people who live where the herds of elephants are increasing, where the packs of wolves are attacking livestock. They have an impact on the livelihood of people who live around these regions, and how can that be compensated for?
Yes, and thank you for your question. I'm going to focus on the forest elephant as an example, because you have to remember forest elephants, populations are decreasing. They're going to go extinct in 10 years. What has changed is we keep encroaching, in their land. And that has led to human-wildlife conflict, where elephants go onto farms, they destroy property, and also, humans die in that event. Unfortunately, we have a very, how can I say, human answer to that problem, which is electrical fences, which is guns, and it's a very defensive kind of move. There are better solutions out there. There are more holistic solutions, such as surrounding your farm with beehives or with chili little plantations. Elephants don't like that. They don't like bees, they don't like chilies. Farmer gets an additional source of income. He gets honey that he can sell in the market. He gets, chilies he can sell in the market. So here it's about building holistic solutions for the elephant not to encroach on the human land and for creating the farm an additional source of income. So that's one aspect to that problem. The second aspect is how can you create economic incentives for us not to encroach on their land, right? So we're going into their territories, sometimes to build farms because that is the only form of sustenance for some of those local people. What happens if you can start creating jobs? Because through, for example, our projects, we can actually provide additional infrastructure, right? And that brings education, that brings new job opportunities for them. So we can create new forms of employment where they can sustain their families and their community that does not involve encroaching on elephant territory. So I think there's a two approach here, creating new job opportunities for individuals, and then for protecting the existing human assets in a more holistic way that does not involve killing or harming an animal. I hope that answers your question.
And I just wanted to add, I mean, the ocean has the benefit of having less of those conflicts, where you have like 70% of the Earth is ocean, and some of those, ecosystems where the marine life thrives are actually very small compared to the bigger whole. Like, so it's like less than 0.1% of the ocean is coral reefs, but more than a third of all marine life is around those areas, and they don't really interfere. In fact, they benefit fishers, for example, because around those coral reefs there is more life, and if you protect those and if you manage them well, actually it's beneficial for humans. But there is that element, for example, with mangrove forests, where you have a choice to make sometimes. As a local government, you say like, well, we could be building this new hotel, or we could be doing these things like that could benefit the community, and there are these mangrove forests. What do we do? And then it's about making that case of highlighting that protecting and preserving those mangrove forests, they create these economic benefits, they do create jobs. And then when we build those markets, then we actually see that they're more valuable than building another hotel, for example. And just an example from Indonesia that we highlighted in our work is this seaweed farming, where a lot of those fishers that have noticed that the fish stock is declining, they have been retrained, or they have seen opportunities in going for a new kind of profitable business, which is kind of seaweed farming. So there's also the opportunity to retrain, reskill, and embrace a new ecosystem that is helping to restore ecosystems.
Thank you. Yes, do you want to know? Okay.
I've been following the chat for our online participants, and it's quite interesting to see the different comments. We had a comment on there has been so much bought carbon credits that have been destroyed in fires. Only plus point is that the ash that runs into the rivers and oceans that can be beneficial. So we hear a lot that argument when we talk about natural capital, that this is going into privatization, commercialization, and it seems it's really difficult to explain that we are talking here about a new economic paradigm, that we're talking about a way to conclude the consumer and also future investors in a novel way. I've heard several times from you, the next generation, that definitely has a different perspective on how to invest their money. So how do the projects that you have been mentioning or you're working on, how do they ensure that the interests of the next generation are actually as well taken into account, and not focusing only about the current players, stakeholders that we have right now in the market.
Yeah, if I may just respond to that quickly. So, I mean, the example mentioned in the question is a really good one, because when we had the situation, Pakistan, for example, the flooding, destroying lots of kind of ecosystems that have been used as, for carbon credits, the wildfires and so on. And as I mentioned, for example, mangrove forests are not only 50 times or so more efficient as a carbon storage, they also don't have that risk as much. They do have some risk, like marine heat waves, but certainly not from wildfires. So they are more protected, and they are a good source of, as a carbon sink. So in a way, they shield from some of those problems. But you're absolutely right, and the question, insinuates that it is about, supporting ecosystems that are not just for the current generation, but for future generations. And in a way, those trade-offs, like for example, do we build this hotel? Do we regenerate that mangrove? Have to be made with intergenerational justice in mind. That is why it's so vital to create these markets, because if we don't have those markets, it will be more difficult for governments and for economic stakeholders, business and so on, to make that case that that mangrove forest is worth more than that hotel. Because if we don't have that assessment of the natural value of that mangrove forest, it is more difficult to make that case that for future generations will benefit more from the revenue from that mangrove forest than from the hotel. So intergenerational justice is absolutely vital as part of that conversation.
So there's, I'm not sure I understood the full question, but there's many ways in which the engaging the next generations actually happens. So in the project in Argentina, for instance, I mentioned that local communities and the next generations in those local communities actually participate in the discussions around the territorial development plan and the priorities. That's one way in which I think all stakeholders need to be engaged, not just the traditional ones. There's obviously, I mentioned NFTs. First of all, those tokens that I was referring to are not just for corporate investors and institutional investors. I'm sure a lot of people around the world will love to buy Walid's token to save elephants, for instance. So in many different ways, people have a choice individually to decide to support such or such project based on their preferences and based on their priorities. They can exert pressure on corporates and the investors. Let's not underestimate the power of retail investors that have a very strong say in how their assets are being invested. And there's a whole new range of revenue mechanisms around NFTs, etc., that really put the power in the hand of citizens and individuals and people to decide to fund the projects that they want to fund. So there's mechanisms and there's ways in which people can express their preferences and their priorities and participate actually in supporting and almost voting for through their money, whether it's an investment, whether you're an investor, you're a consumer, you're an employee, you can actually decide to influence those choices. And because of the raising awareness that I think Walid was referring to a bit earlier, there's more and more options and pathways for people to engage and to also express their priorities and to be part of that process in a way. And I think that's extremely valuable.
So basically, referring to the comments in the chat, you are saying that we have the technology, we have the instruments, but we need the right communication and we need the engagement of those that can actually provide for a long-term shift in the market.
I'd say so, yeah.
I just want to build on what Aiaze is saying and to answer your question. We need to remember something, right? And for those of us who are old enough, you wanted to go on a date, you'd go to a bar, a restaurant, or somebody's house. Now you swipe on Tinder. If you need to go and get your money out, you would go to your local bank and talk to your bank manager. Now you do that on your mobile. You don't have to go in the street, to call a taxi. You use Uber. As long as propositions are coming out that are easier, that are maybe cheaper, and add more value, we will start shifting. The solutions that we're talking about are here to answer our problem, which is you look on the news, you hear the warm voice of David Attenborough telling you about the beauty of nature. By the end of the day, you're scared. You're scared about we're all going to perish. It's about providing us solutions that are inspiring and that we can feel we have a measurable and definite impact in a positive way. And I think that's what is important to do. But also then you've got to look at a country level. As probably a lot of you would have seen, the Democratic Republic of Congo is looking to sell a large portion of land, for oil exploitation. It is also peatland, which has a huge carbon storage. Now, any government official that says, okay, I'm going to sell this and I'm going to get you $10 billion, let's say, for the next 10 years. They don't have any other alternative, right? What happens is suddenly a platform like the ones we're discussing here, it's actually, we can give you $500 million every year. But the difference between us and oil companies, we're not about extraction. We're about regeneration. We're here to give you $500 million for eternity, forever. Because we're monetizing the ecosystem services that are produced from that land, whether it is in the plants, whether it is in the soil, whether it is in the keystone species. That's the option that does not really exist today, that we're all trying to build. And coming back to the generation, we at Rebalance, we're building a use council so that we can pass on the baton to them when we're too old to continue ourselves. So it's important to get that viewpoint across, to integrate within the DNA of the company, and for them to continue the work we're doing.
Excellent, thank you. Just looking at the time, we have 12 more minutes for our discussion. Just for your information, after our panel discussion, we will meet here again and share some key takeaways with the others that have been in the other panel. I would love to actually do a round with the four of you and ask you what would be your biggest wish for your specific ecosystem that you're representing. You talked about ocean assets, for instance. Walid, you talk about elephants and so on. What would be your wish, be it in relation to the EU taxonomy, be it in relation to new markets that you see emerging? What would be your main point that you want to bring across, that this is something that you are passionate about and you will be continuing working for?
Okay. This conference about valuing natural capital. When we talk about carbon credit, we consider only one ecosystem service, which is the carbon sequestration, the capture and the storage of the carbon. But we have seen that ecosystems have many other services. To evaluate those services, we rely on the natural science. We have to understand the ecological functions of not only the species, but also their habitat, the whole ecosystem. And it is important that we can evaluate the natural capital like this as a whole and science-based. And then we can use this to go to your case studies.
I've been trying to figure out the answer to this question, and I'm going to paint you a picture. Apologies if there's any CFOs here in the room, but I want a CFO to come out of the board meeting and show this dashboard that shows all the species in which their corporate has invested in, and to be able to say, this is the impact we're having at a biodiversity level, at a species level. This is how those local communities who live around those species, education, health factor, economic growth has all gone up. I then want them to be able to go home and at the family dinner to say to their kids, you know what, forest elephants are not on a passive extinction. And that's in part due to the investment our company is doing. I think there's an opportunity here for those CFOs to be able to merge their private life and their professional life and say with pride what they're doing at a corporate and at an individual level. That's what I'd like to wish for.
That was a great response. I can't copy you, Walid. I think I'll probably respond along the lines of your previous question, actually. I think my hope and my wish would be that those type of projects that we're all currently designing and working on will continue and contribute to raising public and global awareness around those issues in such a way that it will help corporates, organizations, employees, individuals reconnect at a much deeper level with nature, with more intimacy, a deeper relationship, if you would like, across society and across the economy in such a way that all of us at some point in our lives, in this generation and the next ones, could become active participants in conservation directly through the choices that we make, and that it will drive a behavioral change at a global level, really. So for me, that would be sort of the ultimate goal. This is just a stepping stone towards that.
Yeah, great. I mean, just to build on those great concluding words from the fellow panelists, I mean, it's about waking up to the opportunity, but also the missed opportunity if we don't embrace nature. And I think this is from different stakeholders. I mean, for example, you know, business could start to embrace it. I mean, I like this example of the CFO, because we are with biodiversity and nature at this stage where we were about 5 to 10 years ago with climate change and carbon. You know, we had CDP starting to really measure supply chain emissions and so on. And this is going to happen. You know, if you're a business today and you think, you know, what do we need to do to make our business future proof? It is starting to report about your nature impacts. It's about starting to, you know, to invest in these kind of nature-based solutions and, you know, carbon credits and biodiversity credits and so on, because ultimately this is, you can be an early mover. You can benefit from this in terms of your long-term profit, because it is coming through the EU taxonomy, through CDP, GRI, the reporting frameworks. All these kind of things are happening, and it's now that you can start to become an early mover and benefit and reap the rewards once it becomes mainstream. And also in terms of countries and policymakers, I mean, it's really shocking to see how few countries have so far embraced nature-based solutions to natural capital in their NDCs. And now we have COP27 coming up in a country in the developing world. A lot of focus has been on adaptation and resilience. Now it is about, you know, can more countries actually start embracing natural capital in their NDCs? For example, this statistic about seagrass is just stunning, that, you know, 159 countries have access to seagrass, but only about 10 or so even acknowledge that it is a solution for climate change. So really what we need is countries and policymakers and business waking up to it, because regulators are starting to wake up with it, to it, because we can see this with the EU taxonomy. So be an early mover, embrace the change and benefit from it.
Thank you for the great panelists, and thank you for the organizers of this conference. I was very happy to be here with you. I hope you enjoyed this session. And the last word is maybe for Marianne.
Thank you, Nathalie, and also thank you, each one of you, Walid, Aiaze, Martin, Nathalie. It's a pleasure to hear about your projects, and in particular, I was very impressed what you shared, Aiaze. I remember when you shared about the project in Argentina, it was still at the very beginning, and now it seems it developed really fast now to this point, and I believe that we will be able to see more of these trailblazing projects that will provide a good example of how to build such solutions that can be actually applied in other areas. So you all showed that irrespectively if it's ocean or land-based, there are a lot of principles that we can apply, and I assume that the conversation that is right now happening in the other panel on tech and governance, they are touching on specific principles that market players should be embracing and applying, so that we reach those goals and those nice pictures of a CFO that would show the impact portfolio in a way that we have never seen before. So I will now conclude our session. We can still continue our chat. We will now have our lunch break, and we'll continue talking about innovative finance and also about creating the triple wins, which is really providing for a little bit deeper dive of what we just have been discussing, of connecting livelihood, social economic sustainability in this matter. Thank you so much, and also greetings to our online participants.